What's the fastest you've ever seen someone legitimately become rich? Story 1. The man who won a fortune and simply walked away. My name is Daniel Reyes, and for 8 years I worked the same warehouse floor as Marcus Webb, stacking pallets on the night shift at a regional shipping company. Marcus and I weren't close friends exactly, but we were the kind of coworkers who share a coffee pot every night and know each other's small routines. Every Friday, without fail, Marcus stopped at the gas station on his way home and bought a single scratch-off lottery ticket. It was a habit, nothing more. He used to joke it was cheaper than therapy. One Friday in early spring, Marcus didn't show up for his usual overtime shift. Nobody thought much of it at first. People call in sick. But when Monday came and he still wasn't there, and his phone rang straight to voicemail, some of us started to worry. It wasn't until nearly a month later that a mutual friend mentioned, almost in passing, that Marcus had won close to $100 million in the state lottery. What struck me wasn't the number. It was what he did, or rather, didn't do, with it. I heard through the grapevine that he'd hired a financial advisor almost immediately and set up some kind of trust to keep his name out of the news as much as legally possible. He bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb, nothing like the mansions you'd expect. He traded his old pickup truck for a brand new Honda Civic, which felt almost like a joke given the size of his winnings. But the part that really got to people at the warehouse was how he left. No 2-week notice, no goodbye party, no case of beer for the crew, nothing. He simply stopped coming. Our supervisor eventually confirmed Marcus had resigned, but by then the news of his win had already spread, and most of us understood why he'd vanished the way he did. A few guys tried calling him, texting him, even reaching out through old mutual friends. As far as I know, none of them ever heard back. I ran into him exactly once, almost a year later, at a hardware store on the other side of town. He looked well, calmer, somehow, than I remembered him at work. We spoke for maybe 5 minutes. He was polite, even warm, but there was a clear wall there that hadn't existed before. He didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. I understood, watching him walk to his car, that whatever door had connected his old life to the new one had been closed on purpose, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I've thought about Marcus a lot since then, more than I probably should. Part of me was hurt, honestly. 8 years of shared shifts and small talk, and then nothing. Not even a text. But the longer I sat with it, the more I understood his logic, even if I didn't love how it felt on the receiving end. $100 million changes the math of every relationship in your life. Suddenly, every old coworker is a potential favor to ask, every acquaintance a potential liability. Cutting it all off cleanly, however cold it looked from the outside, was probably the safest and most disciplined thing he could have done. If I'm honest with myself, I don't think Marcus owed any of us an explanation, a party, or even a goodbye. We were coworkers, not family, and money that large forces people to redraw the boundaries of who gets access to their life. What I do think, though, is that there's a lesson in how quietly he handled it. No flashy cars, no headlines, no chasing a lifestyle he wasn't built for. He protected himself first, and whatever you think of the silence, you can't argue with the results. I just wish, selfishly, that the door hadn't closed on all of us quite so completely. Story 2. The manager who stayed to train her replacement. My name is Priya Chandran, and I worked under Susan Whitfield for nearly 4 years in the customer relations department of a mid-sized insurance firm. Susan was my direct manager, but honestly, she felt more like a mentor. She was the person who trained me when I started, who covered for me when my daughter was sick, who never once made me feel small for asking a question twice. Susan bought a lottery ticket every week, same as a lot of people in our office did, more as a running joke among the team than any real expectation. So when she came into work one Tuesday, looking pale and unusually quiet, a few of us assumed something was wrong. It wasn't until she called me into her office privately, later that afternoon, that she told me what had actually happened. She had won an enormous jackpot. Life-changing money, more than any of us could fully process standing there in that small office. What she did next is the part I still think about regularly. She didn't quit on the spot, even though she legally and practically could have. Instead, she went to our director the very next morning and gave formal notice, requesting the standard 2 weeks like any other departing employee, despite having zero obligation to do so. For those 2 weeks, she showed up exactly on time every single day. She didn't coast. She sat with me for hours, walking through every client file, every process, every tricky account she'd been personally managing, making sure I wouldn't be blindsided after she left. On her final day, she gathered the department and told us, quite openly, that she planned to donate roughly half of her winnings to local education and healthcare charities. The rest, she said, She intended to invest carefully and use to spend more time with her aging parents, something her work schedule had never really allowed before. There was no dramatic speech, no tears, just Susan being exactly as steady and generous as she'd always been. After she left, I took over most of her client relationships, and I can say with certainty that the transition was smooth almost entirely because of the effort she put in during those final 2 weeks. I still keep a small notebook she left behind, full of her handwritten notes on difficult clients and how to handle them. I use it more often than I'd like to admit. I've worked with a lot of managers before and since, and none of them prepared me the way Susan did, even the ones who had every incentive to keep their jobs long-term. Watching someone with tens of millions of dollars suddenly available to her still show up on time, still care about getting the handoff right, taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way. It would have been so easy for her to disappear the moment the numbers were confirmed. Nobody would have blamed her. My honest take, looking back, is that money doesn't create character, it just reveals whatever was already there. Susan was thoughtful and responsible long before she ever won anything, and the money simply gave her the means to express that on a larger scale. Through the training, through the donations, through the 2 weeks she didn't have to give us but gave anyway. I sometimes wonder how many other winners out there had that same generosity in them and just never got the chance to show it, because the sudden noise of the money made everyone assume the worst instead. Story 3. The salesman who closed the deal of a lifetime. My name is Jordan Kim, and I sat 2 desks away from Ethan Cole for almost 3 years in the enterprise sales division of a software company. We weren't drinking buddies outside of work, but we were close in the way that people who share a sales floor become close. Trading leads, commiserating over lost deals, celebrating small wins together at our desks. Ethan spent nearly a full year chasing a single account. A massive multinational manufacturing client that everyone in the office had privately written off as a lost cause. Competitors kept undercutting him on price, the client kept stalling, and more than once I watched him get off a call looking completely defeated. But he never stopped adjusting his pitch, never stopped finding new ways to demonstrate value instead of just cutting the price to compete. When the contract finally closed, the final number floored the entire office. $16 million. The single largest deal our company had ever signed. Under our commission structure, Ethan was entitled to 10% of that figure. I remember him sitting at his desk that afternoon, staring at his monitor, not saying a word for what felt like 10 full minutes. What impressed me afterward wasn't the size of the check, honestly. It was how little his day-to-day life seemed to change at first. He didn't buy a sports car. He and his wife eventually moved into a slightly larger house, nothing extravagant, and he quietly met with a financial planner every few weeks for months afterward. About a year later, he negotiated a reduced schedule with management, agreeing to work part-time, taking on only the specific accounts he found genuinely interesting instead of chasing every lead that came through the pipeline. I asked him once, over lunch, whether the deal had changed how he thought about the job. He told me it hadn't changed how he felt about the work itself, but it had completely changed his relationship with urgency. He no longer felt the need to chase every commission check like his life depended on it, and that shift, he said, made him a calmer and honestly more effective salesman than he'd ever been before. I still work in sales, and I think about Ethan's year-long pursuit of that account more often than I'd expect. It's easy in this industry to get discouraged after a few rejections and start competing purely on price, cutting margins just to close something, anything. Watching him hold his ground on value instead, for almost 12 straight months of stalling and setbacks, taught me more about patience in this job than any training program ever did. If I'm being fully honest, part of me still feels a small twinge of envy when I think about that number landing in his account. That's a natural, human reaction, and I won't pretend otherwise. But what I respect most, looking back, is that he didn't let the money change his ambition into complacency, nor did he let it turn into recklessness. He used it to buy back control over his own time, which strikes me as a far smarter use of sudden wealth than most people manage. It's the discipline afterward, not the deal itself, that actually impressed me. Story 4. The roommate who held his startup shares through every rough patch. My name is Alex Turner, and Ryan Osei was my college roommate for 2 years before we both graduated and went our separate professional ways, though we stayed close over the following decade. Ryan joined a small technology startup right out of school, back when the company had maybe 30 employees and an office that still smelled like fresh paint. I remember visiting him during those early years and hearing him talk about the company's struggles almost every time we caught up. There were rounds of layoffs he barely survived, a product launch that flopped so badly the founders nearly shut the whole thing down, and long stretches where Ryan admitted his paycheck felt barely worth the stress. Several of his co-workers left during those years for better paying, more stable jobs at larger companies. I asked him more than once why he stuck around. His answer was always some version of the same thing. He believed in what they were building, and he didn't want to walk away from the equity he'd been slowly vesting into over the years, even though, at the time, that equity was worth essentially nothing on paper. It felt, honestly, like a bit of a gamble whenever we discussed it, and I'll admit I privately worried he was making a mistake staying so long at a company that seemed perpetually on the edge of collapse. The company eventually found its footing, pivoting its product in a direction that finally caught on with a much larger market than before. Growth accelerated over the next few years, and then came the news that changed everything. A major tech corporation acquired the company outright, at a valuation none of us could have imagined back in that little office with the fresh paint smell. As one of the earliest and longest-tenured employees, Ryan's accumulated shares were suddenly worth an amount that let him retire before he'd even turned 35. I remember the phone call when he told me. He wasn't shouting or celebrating wildly. He sounded almost stunned, repeating the number a couple of times as if saying it out loud might make it feel more real. We met up a few weeks later, and he looked genuinely lighter, like a weight he'd been carrying for close to a decade had finally lifted off his shoulders. What I keep coming back to, thinking about Ryan's story, is how many opportunities he had to walk away and didn't. Every single one of those exits would have been completely reasonable, given how uncertain things looked for years at a time. It's easy, from the outside, to only see the payoff at the end and assume it was some obvious, inevitable outcome. It wasn't. It was years of genuine uncertainty that could just as easily have ended with him walking away with nothing, the way it did for several of his former co-workers who left earlier. My honest evaluation is that Ryan's story is inspiring, but I try not to oversell it as a formula anyone can replicate. For every person who stays and gets rewarded like he did, there are plenty who stay just as long at companies that simply fail and walk away with nothing to show for the years they gave. Ryan got both the conviction and the outcome right, and I respect that, but I'm careful never to frame his patience alone as the secret ingredient. Luck and timing played their part too. Story 5. The neighbor who came home to a fortune he never touched. My name is Lewis Bennett, and Victor Hale lived 2 houses down from me for years before everything changed. We weren't especially close before his arrest. Friendly enough to wave across the yard, occasionally borrow a tool. But our paths crossed again years later under very different circumstances, and that's really where this story begins for me. Victor had run some kind of online operation years earlier, dealing in digital currency payments through corners of the internet most people never see. I never asked for the full details, and honestly, I preferred not to know. He was arrested around 2014 and ended up serving roughly 7 years, and during that whole stretch, the neighborhood mostly assumed he was gone for good, his house eventually sold off, his name rarely mentioned anymore. When Victor was released and unexpectedly moved back into the area for a short while before relocating permanently, I ran into him at the local hardware store, of all places. We talked for a while, catching up on the years that had passed, and he mentioned, almost casually, that a portion of digital currency he'd accumulated before his arrest had never been located or seized during the investigation. In the years he'd spent locked away, that currency's value had climbed to an almost unbelievable degree, turning what had once been a relatively modest sum into a fortune. He didn't seem boastful about it, more matter of fact, almost bewildered by his own luck. He told me he planned to leave the country and settle somewhere in Southeast Asia, somewhere quiet and far removed from his old life, where the money would stretch considerably further and where, frankly, fewer people would recognize his name or his history. Within a couple of months, his house went up for sale, and he was gone. I've thought about that conversation a lot since then. Victor didn't work a single day for that fortune in any conventional sense. He simply waited it out behind bars while an asset he happened to own appreciated wildly due to forces entirely outside his control or effort. It's an unusual kind of luck, tied directly to activity that landed him in prison in the first place. My honest evaluation of Victor's story is complicated, and I won't pretend otherwise. Part of me finds it hard to fully begrudge a person for holding an asset that simply, legally, belonged to him, regardless of how he originally acquired it. But another part of me can't ignore the uncomfortable optics of it all. A man profiting enormously from currency tied to activities that landed him in prison, while people who spent those same 7 years working honest, difficult jobs accumulated a tiny fraction of what he walked away with. I don't think Victor did anything illegal by holding onto that wallet. I just think it's a stark reminder that the line between legitimate and troubling wealth isn't always as clean as we'd like it to be, and that sometimes the system simply doesn't have a mechanism for weighing that discomfort against what's technically lawful. Story 6. The night guard who mined a fortune on a borrowed laptop. My name is Carlos Mendez, and Tom Whitaker and I worked the overnight security shift together at a small regional bank branch for almost 3 years. Night shifts like ours are long and mostly uneventful. You're mainly there in case something goes wrong, which most nights, thankfully, it doesn't. We passed a lot of quiet hours talking about nothing in particular. Sometime around 2012, Tom got interested in this obscure digital currency he'd read about on some tech forum, something called Bitcoin that almost nobody outside a small circle of enthusiasts had heard of at the time. He explained it to me one night, and I remember not really understanding half of what he was describing, mostly nodding along out of politeness. He started bringing his personal laptop to work, running some kind of program on it during our slow hours that, as he explained it, was solving complex calculations to earn small amounts of this currency. I honestly thought it was a strange, mostly pointless hobby at the time, the kind of thing people get into and quietly abandon within a few months. Tom kept at it for a good while, though, letting that laptop run quietly beside him most nights, barely mentioning it after the first few months of enthusiasm wore off. Eventually, he stopped bringing it up altogether, and I assumed, like most passing interests, it had just fizzled out. Years later, long after Tom and I had both moved on to different jobs and lost regular touch, mutual friends mentioned that the currency he'd been mining all those nights had increased in value by an almost incomprehensible amount. I reached out to him out of curiosity, and he confirmed it, sounding almost sheepish about the whole thing, like he still couldn't quite believe those quiet overnight hours years earlier had turned into something so significant. He told me he hadn't touched most of it for years after prices started climbing, partly out of uncertainty about how to even convert it responsibly, and partly, I think, out of a kind of disbelief that it was really worth what people said it was worth. Eventually, he cashed out a portion, enough to pay off his mortgage entirely and set aside a solid cushion for his kids' education, while leaving the rest invested for the long term. Looking back at those overnight shifts, I sometimes laugh at how unremarkable it all felt in the moment. We were just two guys trying to stay awake through boring hours, and one of us happened to be quietly building something that would matter enormously a decade later, while the other one, me, mostly just watched and occasionally teased him about wasting his laptop's battery on nonsense. My honest take is that Tom's story is really a story about low-stakes curiosity paying off in a way nobody could have predicted, not a repeatable strategy. He wasn't chasing wealth those nights. He was just bored and curious, and it happened to work out spectacularly. I'd caution anyone who hears this story and thinks they can simply replicate it today by picking some new, obscure currency. The specific moment Tom stumbled into, early and nearly unnoticed, isn't something you can manufacture on demand. Sometimes the reward really does just come down to being early and patient, with no guarantee it ever will again. Story 7. My uncle who built an empire from a second shift. My name is Diego Fuentes, and Hector Fuentes is my uncle on my mother's side, a man I've looked up to for as long as I can remember. For years, Hector worked the night shift as a supervisor at an HVAC maintenance company, a stable but unglamorous job that paid the bills for his family without much room for anything extra. What most people outside the family didn't know was that during the day, before catching a few hours of sleep and heading back to his night shift, Hector was quietly building his own small air conditioning repair business, taking on individual clients here and there, doing the repairs himself, keeping his own books late at night at the kitchen table. I remember visiting as a kid and seeing him exhausted most of the time, running almost entirely on coffee and sheer stubbornness. Slowly, through word of mouth and a reputation for honest, reliable work, his small side business started to grow. He hired one technician, then two, then several more as demand kept increasing. The real turning point came when he successfully bid on a maintenance contract for a regional chain of discount retail stores. Just a handful of locations at first, but the relationship expanded steadily over time, until his company was servicing more than 100 store locations across the region. Within about 3 years of that first contract, what had started as an exhausted man running on almost no sleep had become a legitimate company with dozens of employees on payroll. What I've always admired most, though, isn't the growth itself, but something Hector has kept up every single week since the business took off. Every Friday, he closes the shop a little early and takes part of his team out to do free repair work for elderly residents and struggling families in the neighborhood where he grew up. I asked him once why he still bothered with the Friday visits, now that the business clearly didn't need the goodwill for marketing purposes anymore. He told me, without much fanfare, that he remembered too clearly what it felt like to need help and not be able to afford it, and he didn't see any reason success should make him forget that. My honest evaluation, as someone who watched this unfold from the inside of the family, is that Hector's story is the clearest example I know